Liam arrived at Blackwood Forest just as the sun began its slow descent. He was young, confident, perhaps a little arrogant. The locals in the nearby sleepy village of Oakhaven had warned him. No one camps in Blackwood anymore. An old woman at the general store had croaked, her eyes like shadowed pools. Not after dark, not since the disappearances started again. Liam had simply smiled, a polite, dismissive gesture he often used. He thought their tales were just that, stories, old superstitions meant to scare off tourists or keep children in line. He was here for solitude, for the thrill of the wild, not for ghost stories. The warnings, however, were specific, unsettling in their detail. The old woman spoke of whispers on the wind that weren't the wind at all. She mentioned fleeting shadows that danced just beyond the firelight, shapes that belonged to no known creature. She told him the forest didn't like visitors, especially those who stayed past the witching hour. It changes them, she'd said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp, or it takes them. Liam had thanked her for her concern, paid for his supplies, and left the musty scent of the store behind, eager to prove their fears unfounded. He was a man of logic. He believed in what he could see and touch. He found a small clearing, a little deeper than he initially intended, but the spot felt right. The ancient trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches gnarled and heavy with moss. He set up his tent with practiced efficiency. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a while there was peace. The sounds were ordinary. The rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl, the crackle of the small fire he built. He watched the flames lick at the kindling, a small beacon against the encroaching gloom. The forest seemed to breathe around him, a slow, rhythmic sigh. But as twilight bled into true night, a subtle shift occurred. The ordinary sounds began to fade. An unnatural stillness crept into the woods, heavy and expectant. The fire, which had seemed so cheerful moments before, now cast long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. Liam felt a prickle on his skin, the distinct sensation of being watched. He told himself it was just the isolation, the power of suggestion from those silly village tales. Yet a small cold knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. He was alone, utterly alone, or so he hoped. The last vestiges of daylight vanished completely. Darkness, thick and absolute, pressed in from all sides. The cheerful chirping of crickets ceased. The hooting owl fell silent. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. Liam strained his ears, listening for any familiar sound, any reassurance that the world beyond his small campsite still existed. But there was nothing. Only a profound, unnerving silence that seemed to hum with an unspoken tension. He poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the oppressive blackness, a small act of defiance against the encroaching dread. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Then the whispers started. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of dry leaves, but with a cadence, a rhythm that wasn't natural. Liam froze, his head cocked. He told himself it was the wind, sighing through the dense canopy high above, but there was no wind. Not a single leaf stirred on the branches around his camp. The whispers grew, not in volume but in clarity. They were sibilant, hushed, like secrets being shared just out of earshot. He couldn't make out words, not yet, but the intent felt chillingly clear. They were aware of him. Shadowy figures began to flicker at the very edge of his vision. He'd turn his head quickly, shining his powerful flashlight into the inky blackness between the trees, but there was never anything there. Just the dense tangle of undergrowth, the unblinking trunks of ancient oaks and pines. Yet when he looked away back at the relative safety of his fire, the peripheral movements would return. Elusive shapes, darker than the surrounding night, darting and retreating. The fire, his only source of comfort, now seemed to conspire against him, its dancing light creating a macabre theatre of moving shadows all around his small sanctuary. A profound sense of dread began to seep into Liam's bones, cold and insidious. The initial peace he had felt was a distant memory, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He thought about packing up, about fleeing back to the relative sanity of the village, but a strange inertia held him captive. Part of it was fear. The thought of stumbling through the darkened, hostile woods was terrifying, but another part, something he couldn't quite understand, was a morbid curiosity, a pull towards the source of the encroaching horror. He felt trapped, not by any physical barrier, but by the forest's suffocating will. Midnight came and went, marked only by the chilling of the air. It wasn't a natural cold, it was a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The whispers intensified. They were no longer just formless sounds. Now they seemed to coalesce into something vaguely resembling his name. Liam! A drawn-out, breathy exhalation that slithered through the trees. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them, echoing directly inside his skull. He was starting to doubt his own sanity. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay put, to cower by the dying embers of his fire, he made a decision. He had to know. He had to see what was out there. Armed with his flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous swathe through the darkness, he left the relative safety of his campsite. He pushed deeper into the forest. The trees, which had seemed merely imposing before, now took on a malevolent quality. Their branches, twisted and bare, looked like skeletal arms reaching for him. He could have sworn their trunks subtly shifted, closing in behind him, cutting off his retreat. He looked up. The sky, glimpsed through the dense canopy, was not the familiar starry expanse he expected. It flickered, not like lightning, which would have been a comfort in its familiarity, but like a faulty fluorescent light, or an old film projector about to give out. The stars themselves seemed to pulse erratically, some winking out of existence, only to reappear moments later in a slightly different position. Reality felt thin here, stretched taut, on the verge of tearing. The path he thought he was following began to twist in impossible ways, looping back on itself, leading him further into an Escher-like nightmare. The voices grew more distinct, no longer just whispers of his name, but the voices of people he knew. His mother's gentle call, his childhood best friend's laughter, twisted into something mocking. "Liam, come find us," they seemed to say, their words carried on the unnaturally cold breeze. "We're waiting for you, deeper in, come play." He knew it wasn't real, it couldn't be. Yet the longing, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe it was, pulled him onward, deeper into the suffocating, shifting darkness of Blackwood Forest, where the known world was rapidly unravelling. The digital display on his watch read 3 a.m., an hour known for its unholiness, for the thinning of veils, and then he saw it, looming out of the oppressive darkness, a structure, an abandoned cabin, ancient and dilapidated, its timbers warped and blackened by time and weather. It sagged precariously, as if the forest itself were slowly trying to consume it. Strange, unsettling symbols were carved deeply into the doorframe and around the darkened window openings. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly luminescence in the beam of his flashlight, symbols he didn't recognize but which filled him with an instinctive revulsion. He pushed open the creaking door. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, dust, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Dust motes, thick as snow, danced in the beam of his flashlight. The interior was sparse. A single rotting wooden table stood in the centre of the small room, one leg shorter than the others, causing it to tilt. And on that table lay an old, leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and stained, the pages within yellowed and brittle. He reached for it with a trembling hand, a sense of grim inevitability settling over him. He opened the journal. The script inside was spidery, frantic. It spoke of the forest, Blackwood. It was an entity, ancient and malevolent. The journal chronicled generations of disappearances, people who had wandered into its depths and never returned. It spoke of rituals, of strange occurrences, of a presence that dwelled within the oldest parts of the woods. A presence that demanded offerings, that fed on fear and despair. The forest didn't just take people, it consumed them, absorbed them, made them part of its eternal hungry silence. The whispers outside the cabin were deafening now, a chorus of tormented voices. The shadows pressed against the cabin's grimy windows, no longer fleeting but solidifying, taking on vaguely humanoid shapes. The final entry in the journal was barely legible, scrawled in what looked like a desperate hurry. "It knows I'm here. It wants in. It whispers my name. It promises." The sentence trailed off into a smear of ink. Liam could feel the floorboards beneath him vibrating. The shadows seeped under the door, flowed through the cracks in the walls. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The next morning, searchers found only his camera, caked in mud near the ancient, gnarled roots of an oak. Its final recording, a blur of indistinct terror and the sound of encroaching, sibilant whispers.